Hello, everyone. We are live. So
Hello.
we have I hesitate to say an unusual stream today, but maybe it's unusual to what maybe you're used to seeing on the High Graph live streams that we typically do. Every Wednesday, we do a live stream. Oftentimes, it is a relatively technical nature. We look at something lately happening in the Astro community or in Next.js or how to do our management SDK or our app ecosystem, all sorts of stuff like that. We're not going to do any technical stuff today. Well, depending on your definition of technical, I guess. So I'm joined today by our amazing UX researcher, Steffany. Steffany, why don't you give an introduction to yourself?
Hi, I'm Steffany. I'm HighGraph's UX researcher. And UX research, maybe as an introduction, is, in its purest form, what it really is the application of social scientific principles to a private arena. So in this case, it would be to headless CMS or any kind of, let's say, tech realm. It can involve working with product managers, designers. I've worked with teams across entire companies before. Generally, probably a good rule of thumb is if something comes up where you need someone to drill down on a specific problem space, that's a question for a researcher.
So I have a slight history in UX from way back in the day. However, by the time I finished working with a title of UX, I was mainly a front-end developer at that point, doing the occasional quantitative research. So what are the sorts of things that you end up doing on a regular basis in UX research? Because I think it's important. I think a lot of people hear UX and end up thinking visually, right? They end up thinking that finished UX design, right? Which is really just
Right.
a visual design. So what's kind of the difference there?
It's it also it depends a lot on the company as well, but let's say a UX researcher, which stands for user experience, is from a qualitative perspective is going to be meeting with either users or prospective users, and asking them sort of like qualitative interviewing type questions in order to drill down on a problem. It can also include doing usability research, and usability research is going to be specifically on designs that are already created. It can also involve doing any kind of long-term foundational research, which could involve surveys. I have been at places where we'll do diary studies. If anyone doesn't know what a diary study is, it's when you're asking a set of users or people really who you think might use your product to write down their actions or thoughts on a consistent basis, like over a long period of time. And a designer, I don't have anything to do with design. I don't use Figma. I think I opened Photoshop once in the early 2000s when I played around with having a food blog, but any kind of design software, I don't know any really how to use. My background is in psychology. I actually have a master's in counseling psychology.
Nice. I'm gonna drill into two different things real fast. I love the mention of the diary work. One of the things I remember when I was always pitching and kind of selling the idea of you was the idea that, yeah, we can ask questions, but we need to ask the right question. And oftentimes a problem with questions that we hear in product focused work is asking about future behavior. So do you think that you would use this feature? Do you think that this feature would help you?
That is the worst freaking question you can ever ask someone ever. We always like to say the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. If you ask someone, could you visualize yourself using, I don't know, this cool drinking glass? Most people are going to say, sure, why not? It's also, I can't remember the word right now, but you're priming someone to come up with an idea in their mind of when they might find themselves in a situation where whatever product you're selling them, frankly, might come in useful. The other thing I think that is like, yes, it is good to ask our users questions. It's good to stay in touch with our users, but asking users questions is different from research, because when you're doing research, not only are you spending ideally a decent amount of time finding the right users, which means that you are focusing on specific recruitment criteria. You're not going to be asking someone who doesn't work, like, for example, as like a content editor, about a CMS. Like you wouldn't ask necessarily like a designer about a headless CMS, because they may or may not be ever touching that CMS. And if you want to ask questions about like specific functionality, you're not going to be asking your users who never use that functionality. It doesn't make any sense to do this. So aside from asking the right questions, I think a step that a lot of people unintentionally and, you know, with the best of intentions skip is recruitment. Like you have to it's not just about asking the right questions, it's about asking the right people.
Exactly. I think that's, yeah, sorry. I'm just listening and in awe. It was great.
I was ranting like,
That's specifically what we're going for. That's what this stream's all about today. It's going to be great. And speaking of that, for those watching, again, if we say anything, ask questions in chat. If you want us to follow up on anything, I want to follow up on one thing you said very near the beginning, and then you kind of you brought up again, and it's this idea of the like socio-psychological nature of it. So I feel like there's probably not a huge understanding about what you mean by that. I think I understand what you mean by that, but I think we also have to talk about, like, I have a degree in philosophy. We have to talk about the philosophy of language and know that words mean different things to different people. So can we drill in just a little bit on that aspect of what a UX researcher is, and or really just how products should be thought about in general?
When I say that, what I mean is we're focusing on user behavior in the absence of any product whatsoever. A lot of the time, we are trying to focus on, like, for example, I used to work at UCSF in their social psych research center. We were trying to figure out if I worked in their smoking research center. We were trying to figure out if viewing smoking scenes affected subsequent smoking behavior. How do you do that? So like we set up an entire research study around, you know, ethically trying to do this, like, because we couldn't force people to smoke, obviously. And but it's at its core, it's about someone's behavior. How are we trying to get at what they would do naturally? How can we try to figure out if something that we're going to introduce is going to influence their later behavior? When it comes to product research, it's not quite as complicated as that. But what you're trying to figure out is, like, how does someone behave naturally? How is whatever product you're designing, product or software, whatever it is that you are designing, helping them with their day-to-day tasks? When it comes to, for example, a headless CMS, what you'd want to figure out is, does this actually make your job easier, as a very, you know, specific question. It could even mean, honestly, doing research with anyone who uses any kind of CMS system. This is a double positive there, but any kind of CMS, no matter what it is, because at the absolute core, everyone who at least is an end user of a CMS or a headless CMS is probably trying to achieve similar things. And you want to focus more on what that is, as opposed to, let's say, like features or functionality. Like those things all come later, or they can come concurrently with this behavioral aspect, but it's focusing on just one, or honestly, like focusing on just one or the other, you're always going to be missing, you're going to be missing something.
Yeah. Do you want to bring up from chat real fast, Aaron? First, hi, Aaron.
So no, thank you for smoking.
Second, so no, thank you for Smoking Vibes. Thank you for Smoking being actually a really, really funny movie around, honestly, the dark side of what you were just talking about, right? The socio-psychological nature of how marketing works and how
Yes.
the tobacco companies used psychological manipulation to make sure everyone wanted to.
Wanted to smoke.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so actually just as a quick aside, the organization or the part of UCSF that I was working for, this was a while ago, very long time ago, was headed up by the researcher who championed for different smoking laws in California. So he's the reason, at least within the United States, California had some of the strictest smoking laws in the US and they implemented them first. And it was because of this guy.
And again, going back to
No,
data-driven decisions, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, Aaron's going even spicier in chat. I'm gonna let that one fly over there because I want to pivot us to maybe the real topic for the day. You've mentioned it a couple times about thinking about like headless CMS or CMS in general as its own product or system. And honestly, like I don't want to talk about necessarily the difficulties for your job, right? Because I think there's this really interesting pattern that we work at a headless CMS and really what good usability ends up relying on in a headless CMS function, especially a headless CMS function, isn't always what we do, right? The tools that we provide can get filtered through another layer, and it's the implementation layer. And I think there's something probably meaningful to be said around who is actually building the UX in a headless CMS and what they need to think about.
Yeah. I think what's interesting for me about that is it seems as though the implementation of a CMS should really be kind of a team effort. It should be because it's a unique system in that one person is setting it up, or let's say even one person is making the decision. Like the decision maker isn't always even the person who's setting it up or the person who's using it. Then we have someone who's setting it up, or maybe like a team of people who are setting it up. And then we have end users who are actively using the thing on a, let's say, like daily, weekly basis. So if you consider this as a kind of like ecosystem, or as you said, even in any other product sense, there would be a whole lot of research going on even before you got to implementation stage. And, you would be surveying your users. You'd be asking them, how they, like what they need to use this system for, how often they generally use it, if they have any experience with previous headless CMS in the past, like anything to get an idea of how these individuals are going to be using the system, and then taking that feedback and wrapping it in with your implementation of that system. And I'm sure some companies or teams do this, but I haven't seen it directly very often.
Yeah, I think that often happens. I think that when we look at, and I'm sure we've got some actual data on this, but from my experience in kind of the headless game in the CMS world, primarily speaking, most of the people doing the actual implementation aren't even in like the content realm. Most people doing the original implementation of a headless CMS and the content models are going to end up being the developers. And as weird as that sounds, like it makes some sense, right? Because the API is being designed by the content model, and they're the end user of the API, but also they're usually the most technical employee touching it. And sometimes, like even like when you have to think through some of these deeper relations, having that technical understanding really is beneficial for figuring out how the system works. But at the end of the day, the developer is using a part of it, but they're not using the entirety of it, and they're in control of the entirety of it. And I like to think there are plenty of developers out there. that would very much go and have a conversation with their stakeholders.
Yeah.
I also live in the real world, and I understand that's not how it goes. I understand that oftentimes it's here's the API I want, and I need to get the API. So if a developer has never thought about doing any sort of research, has never thought about even having the conversation internally, what should they first start thinking about before diving into it?
I think one of the probably simplest things to think about is who do you assume is going to be using this? And what information would you need from them in order to ensure that the implementation is going to be easy for them to use? And then you need to make sure maybe you have like 4 questions. They need to be the same 4 questions, and you need to ask those 4 questions of every single person that you talk to. Because another thing that I think can get missed with research is it needs to be at least have some kind of standardization. Like even qualitative research should be able to be quantifiable. You should be able to say at the end of even a tiny, brief little conversation with your stakeholders, hey, of these 5 stakeholders, 4 of them really specifically needed this thing, because then you can understand what is going to be the most important for you to focus on. And the other thing is research, even at a small scale like this, is a constantly, let's say, evolving beast. You can go in thinking that, all you needed to do was talk to your, like a couple of editors and maybe a content designer, and then come out from that going, oh no, we actually have like 15 people who are going to be touching this at any given time. And maybe I need to talk to them as well. It's also possible, this has happened to me. You come up with a list of questions to the best of your ability. You're asking even your, I guess in this case, it is internal. I was going to say your internal stakeholders, but maybe you're just thinking to yourself, like what your question should be. You ask the first person those 4 questions and they're like, none of this is relevant to me at all. And then you just go back to the drawing board and you go, okay, fine. Maybe we need to have a conversation about even what is relevant to you. And I need to modify my questions or like my moderation guide based on that feedback. And you kind of repeat yourself again. And then I would also say, that's like a good beginning, is even just know who's going to be using the thing, know what you would need from them to get that thing set up, and just try to make this initial query as like quantifiable as possible. Like don't have 6 different conversations with 6 different people. Have 6 similar conversations with 6 people.
And I think a really cool thing that we can relate to like a developer audience here too is the fact that when you're talking about this, you're literally talking about iterating on the research before you start iterating on the code, right? And developers love iterating. It's great. So iterations everywhere.
I talk about this all the time. Like research is iterative. You should be doing iterative research. It's not something that is static. Even when you think you have the answers, in 6 months, those answers might change.
And when you think about it, in the kind of ever expanding role of the developer audience, right? The developers are always running up against new feature sets that they need to implement. Yeah. And every new feature set, if an editor or if there's content involved in that new feature set, it requires a new model and it requires a new interface. And then we run into the same issues. Anytime you see a system that expands for a couple of years, there's bloat that happens. And so we have to kind of keep questioning that bloat every single time.
Like keep the monster down.
Exactly. Puncture the little areas of like air bubbles that are popping up. We were talking about baking before the stream started. And so in my mind, I baked some rolls last night and the yeast got a little too overactive and there were bubbles.
Oh,
I don't
know. Now I'm thinking about like, I don't know, for some reason that brought me back onto the idea of like ancient spaghetti code where like you can't fire the one developer who's been there for 20 years because they're the only one that knows how anything works.
Exactly.
It's like I mean, it's probably less likely that that would happen in this kind of instance, but like, don't do that.
Well, but here's the thing. I'm gonna get spicy for
You're
a
like,
second.
oh,
On the developer side, right? Like you're absolutely right. That was like I was at an agency where our CTO ended up leaving, and we had done some modernization work and it was working pretty well, but there was still plenty of spaghetti code underneath it. And I took over that development team and like, oh no, like, okay, let me figure all this out. But like that was back then, right? It can't be
yeah,
happening today, but we live in this new world, this new microservices world, this new
yeah,
world where everything is, I mean, we're part of it, right? We're a software as a service company that provides an API for your content data, right? You get that from us. You get your personalization from somewhere else. You get a database over here. You get like these 3 or 4, different places, and the connection and the glue code and all that. I mean, we've got content federation to try to solve some of that, but you have the architect write all this code, whatever it ends up looking like, it's going to be slightly confusing. And we've entered into a new era of a different type. It's a nicer spaghetti code, but it's kind of that. It's like spaghetti services. Maybe it's a new term. Um, so yeah.
yeah.
Anyway,
It's like
there's a great.
the problem is the same, but it looks different. Sorry, I said the problem is the same, it just looks different.
Exactly. The 1 or 2 employees are still the people that are knowledgeable about it. It's just different services now. I do see a good question in the chat. It's a multi-part kind of thing. Aaron's asking, have brief conversations with stakeholders that exists when it comes to CMS. I've always struggled with discussing CMSs because everyone seems to have an opinion here. There's an old truism about opinions. I won't say on air, but everyone
Yeah.
has one, much like other things.
Yeah.
So yeah, everyone's got an opinion on CMSs and has their own, especially if you're in an organization with a lot of editors, has their own understanding of what a CMS should do. So is that a good thing, a bad thing? How do you navigate those conversations?
I mean, everyone always has an opinion about everything, right? Which is fine. I think what can be helpful is if you try to get everyone aligned as far as what are the goals here. And even with a discussion, if we kind of try to remove the idea of like, what is everyone's opinion from the table, and like at least gently try to do that, or maybe say like, hey, we'll have room for this later. Right now, we have like a specific goal in mind, a specific task, whatever that might be, and we need to talk about that. And then also having individual conversations can also, I think, help with this, at least at first, when you're on a sort of, let's say, fact-finding mission, because talking to someone one-on-one, maybe scheduling like 20, 30 minutes is going to be, there's less room for static to creep into that conversation. And then you can take the findings from these individual conversations, interviews, whatever you want to call them, bring them into like a cohesive format maybe, and then we can start talking to maybe a broader audience. And maybe at that point it makes more sense to do like a brainstorm if there are things that we need to vote on, or then maybe we can talk about other opinions. I always like to think of it as, it's kind of like, I was gonna say, it's kind of like you're a kindergarten teacher and like all your kindergartners are so excited. Like they just have so many things that they want to do that day. And that's great. But we need to find a way of making sure that we all know that we're doing like this one thing, and that's cool because we'll have time for other stuff later. Otherwise, you're right. It does end up getting into this cacophony of, yeah, everyone wants to be heard, everyone wants to be seen, everyone wants to feel smart and special. So
I'm feeling very heard and seen right now, maybe in a negative way, as I'm probably the kindergartner that's often there. You're embedded on the product team. I am a king of scope creep. I'm like, oh, that's a really cool feature you're talking about. I want like 15 other features that revolve around that. Can I get those, please? Not now, Brian. Not now. I know that's a great idea, Brian. Good idea. Go. Yeah. We'll get to it. We'll add to the. Yeah. I feel very, very.
Take your crayons and go in the corner and why don't you draw that idea down for me?
Exactly. Which I do, and I do it in code, and I'm like, hey, I made it with the app framework. Look, can we do this?
Come on.
Exactly. I I want to go. Aaron also had another. Again, I love having Aaron. Aaron is actually a friend of mine, a former coworker. Also amazing at scope creep. We used to do that together. But she mentions these people also have a very wide variety of technical skills, and I want to bring up not just technical skills, right? I think that's an important thing to say, especially since there's different types of technical skills. But I want to combine this with something you said earlier when you're talking about headless CMSs and like how when you're audience building or not audience, I'm on a stream, when you're building your group. I can't think of the phrase that you use.
I can't remember either.
Recruitment. When you're doing your recruitment, you might not want to get a designer. However, the interesting thing is, depending on the type of headless CMS that you're building for your teams, you might end up needing the designer because they might be one of the stakeholders. And I'm reminded of, again, my history in agencies where my CEO was a designer, and he loved helping tiny businesses. Like, it was his mission to also help these tiny businesses. And as we got better at things, we started pricing out of what those tiny businesses that he had a huge heart for. I love him so much. He's an amazing guy. So he would occasionally do a really small contract, and he would use a Squarespace, and he would put together, using their system, really nice looking things, but with a very different mindset than a typical CMS user would, because he was coming in from, I want to make it look as nicely as possible. And I'll tell you, those systems were not fun to edit, because he'd also come to me and be like, Bryan, how do I do this CSS thing in the CMS? Oh, Ruben, don't do that. Please don't do that. It looks beautiful, but don't do it. So we have even designers coming into systems, and designers, their design systems are sometimes being incorporated into these systems. So it's a huge variety of different levels and different types of stakeholders. And it goes back to, I think you said, bring like the right groups in at the right time. But how do you start that conversation? How do you figure out what is the right group at that time and navigate that?
Again, I think it's less, the first thing to think about is not so much who are we bringing in, it's what's our project plan and what are our goals, almost. And you go from there. You go, okay, maybe, I don't know, goal number one is who's going to use it the most. Goal number one, talk to the editors. Goal number two, okay, now we need to figure out, like, I can't, like, my mind is a blank, but you have to go from your goal and then think about who you talk to in order to hit that goal. Like, when I'm doing any kind of research plan, I'm never automatically thinking initially about who do I want to talk to. What I'm thinking about is, what's the problem I need to solve? So what's the problem that you need to solve first and foremost? Maybe it's more than one problem. And the people that you need to talk to will be different. And again, I think it's making sure that you're getting as much, let's say, is unbiased information a good term? Like, that's why I suggest talking to people one-on-one at first, as opposed to trying to have like this massive, I know sometimes it seems like you can, have this huge meeting and everything's going to work out perfectly, and you'll be able to just spend 2 hours of your life on it and everyone will walk away and be happy. But that's
riddle me this, Steffany. What are your opinions on focus groups?
I mean, I don't really have I don't really have a defined opinion on focus groups. I kind of think they're a bit outdated. I could see how you would want to use one if it's like for a very specific marketing purpose. But I mean, I participated in a couple of focus groups probably 20 years ago. And I mean, the things that we were generally being asked to do are things that you can gauge now with other methodology, like whether that's A/B testing or that's even just like usability research. I kind of feel as though, I mean, it's not exactly a focus group, but I've done brainstorms with like higher level clients before, let's say, which have been really intriguing. But generally, those are really only effective when you're doing them in person.
Nice.
You know,
So I think interestingly, to go back off focus groups, I just wanted to see if you had like a hot take opinion on focus groups. But
mean, I just don't really know. I mean, they cost so much money, and what are you really doing with them? Like, it's, I, yeah,
but to rein us back in off my own tangent there, I think it's interesting also when we're looking at all of this. Is there a, like we talked about differences in stakeholder type, right? There's definitely, you know, designers, editors, marketers,
yeah.
product managers. There's all these different types. They all have their own systems that they need to worry about. But do you think that there is a difference? Because when you're doing bigger user research, you have a potential recruitment surface of the internet, I guess. I mean, not really, but like B2B, you know, headless CMS users. But internally, are there differences in methodology if you are a company that has 3 to 5 people that are going to be using the CMS versus, say, you're like, come from my history, right? I worked at a newspaper organization where our CMS serviced 13 different newspapers. Each newspaper ranged from having 15 people in the system to 150 people in the system. So I had like this huge surface. Are there differences in methodologies that I need to think about now? Because I honestly, we didn't do research with our newsrooms. We should have. Luckily, I had been in the newsroom. I came up from the newsroom. But are there differences in methodologies between that like 3 to 5 person team versus the huge corporation that has 300 people in the system?
Slightly. You're doing kind of the same thing, but maybe with an additional step. So what I would do in that case is 3 to 5 people. I'd say super easy. You're, doing exactly what I said, meeting one-on-one for interviews. You're having your standardized questionnaire, moderation guide, whatever you want to call it. It's so easy at that for 3 to 5 people to like quantify those responses, and then like follow up with that. With like 1,500 people, what I would do is exactly what we did for the group of 3 to 5, but then kind of iterate with smaller groups until we figure out a survey, and then we're sending the survey to everybody. And that's how you can get responses from a larger group of people, but while being relatively certain that the questions, like, because by the time you get to survey stage, you're doing multiple choice. Like sending open-ended surveys makes, especially with 1,500 people, makes like no sense whatsoever. That
Who
is
wants to
crazy
read all the
talk.
responses?
That is crazy talk. I mean, it's like, I guess you could probably do some sentiment analysis, which is just when you're looking for like emotional like word triggers, but it's best practice would not suggest doing this. It's a crazy talk. But so by the time you get to the survey stage, you can be relatively assured that the 5 to 10 questions that you're going to ask have been validated previously by your smaller sample size, your 3 to 5 people. And then as you send it off, you can get like your larger sample there. So it's like same, but different.
Yeah. It's again, we talked about the iterative process earlier, and you
Yeah.
just get to do more of that now. Like it's the reward. So in kind of a slightly different vein, CMS build outs nowadays rarely happen in a vacuum. It's very rare, except like new businesses crop up all the time, and that's a thing, right? But most of the people who are diving into this world, headless CMS coming from a monolithic CMS, or just wanting to change the CMS for whatever reason, new marketing manager, or the old one's not working for us. It's usually going from an old system to whatever this new system is going to be. Does that change how you want to approach things? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And where do we go from there?
mean, it sounds like a pain in the behind is what it sounds like. Um, I would say, I mean, yes and no. Again, like I always feel as though whenever anyone asks me a research question, I'm like, there's kind of no hard and fast answer.
Sure.
Like there's research methodology to play with, but the answer is always kind of like it depends.
You're on a
It's
developer stream. That's our favorite answer too. Yep.
yeah. Like it really depends on, it's a mix of hard skills and soft skills, if we're being honest. But so in that case, I mean, you kind of have a wealth of data to grab from your previous CMS, whether that is like just from pure usage or whether that's going to be qualitative interviewing. I mean, in this case, you could do anything that I just described, just looking at the old CMS through that lens and then kind of taking all of that feedback to improve how you're going to implement or design the new one. And you would be able, I mean, the only cool thing with that is if you know you have a, like, let's say, hard deadline or hard start date for getting the new CMS implementation, you'd be able to start this process way previous to it, while presumably you still have everything up and running. So you could kind of time it so that there's like it's this seamless process,
It's
which
almost,
is,
yeah.
I was gonna say, like, which is kind of the dream, really. Like that's how, in a perfect world, that's how product research would work anyway, is a year in advance what everyone's going to be doing or what the priorities are going to be, and then you can start designing your beautiful, like, longitudinal research study. You can start interviewing all these people, like doing all of these iterative research practices, and then by the time the like implementation is ready to go, you've got all this beautiful research, and that can be like integrated into the product roadmap. And but it never works that way, because nothing ever does.
I think it's a definite important aspiration, and we can look at it from like a perspective of, I'm not in too many sales conversations. I'm brought in every once in a while when it's a very like technical stakeholder, but I could see it being very, very important when you know that you want to move off of whatever it is for whatever reason, either editor discomfort, developer discomfort, end product issues, whatever that is. Really, before you even start looking at the field, you should probably be doing this sort of research internally. Like you said, a lot of what you do, the product isn't even important. It's the conversation and figuring out the why and the how and all of that. So really, before you even say, we're going to use HighGraph, definitely, it's the coolest thing, blah, blah, blah. Like,
Obviously.
before you do that, you probably want the answer to many of these questions in hand. And I know that for the most part, honestly, our sales team would even love if people came in already having answers to many of these questions, because sometimes we have to kind of pull that out and like talk through like the organizational change that sometimes is important in these things too.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're talking about anything that is going to have so many touch points throughout an organization, it's just worthwhile to have at least semi-consistent conversations about said thing. So, and as you said, it's helpful if you're going into a sales call to really understand, like, what are your needs, not just individually, but as an organization. And what do those needs look like from a pure organizational standpoint? And what do they look like from a more granular individualistic standpoint? And understanding that, being able to go into a sales call or even being able to do your own, like, very cursory desk research is invaluable. It'll also, even if you at the end of all that decide that you're not going to switch CMSs, you will be able to understand maybe how you could tweak little things within the interface that you already have to suit the needs that you've discovered.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of kind of the old system way of things, people either love or hate the system that they live within. And when you are doing your research, when you have your 4 questions, your 5 questions, whatever it is, and you bring those questions in, the people that love or hate aren't neutral, but love or hate the system that they're in. They're either, I feel like, and this is very much opinion based, right? I feel
Mhm.
like you run a risk of either getting an incredibly ranty conversation where it's like, I hate this and this and this and this and this, or you might get a very fear-based response where it's, oh no, what's this new system going to do to me? I'm really scared of whatever the new system is. Like
Mhm.
from a question organization perspective, or from an actual interviewing standpoint, how do you control the conversation in kind of those two? I feel like those are two big like worst case scenarios, but I think they happen.
Yeah. So I guess to answer the first question is, which is about like the questions themselves. I try to stay away from any kind of opinion-based questions. I try to stick more towards either behavioral based or sort of process based questions like how often do you go into your CMS? What are you primarily doing there? How often would you say this specific task takes you? How often are you requesting your developers to make changes within the CMS? How often do those changes take? Things like this. And then you can have, room at the end if for some ranty time, because sometimes like interesting things come up during ranty time.
Yes.
And it is hard to kind of keep people reined in sometimes. One of the things I do is I can take notes at the same time that I'm talking to someone. So I generally am keeping an eye on the time, I'm keeping an eye on my notes, and I'm like listening. This is what counseling training will do. Like I was trained to be a therapist. So these were things I spent half a year just learning how to listen to someone and take notes at the same time. So I can do this relatively easily. And when someone kind of gets off track a little bit, I'll keep an eye on the questions, listen to what they're saying. A lot of the time, they're kind of answering the questions that I already have. So I'll take notes on that. And then if I notice that we're getting a little too off track, you kind of will say something to maybe rein them back in again. Like, okay, I really don't want to interrupt you. Like, this is really interesting stuff, but I've got 5 questions left that we haven't answered yet, and we've got 20 minutes, and I definitely want to make sure that we get you out of here on time.
Talking about their time. Oh, I don't want to impose on
Yes.
you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I've only got you for 20 more minutes. I know you're super busy.
So we talked a little bit about this before. See, like I'm doing the easy version of what you just said. I'm like jotting down questions over here as you talk. Like
Great
many of these
job.
questions for our audience, right? We haven't discussed beforehand. I've got like 5 things I put over in a note doc. Most of what I've asked is not included in that. So Steffany, amazing answers to things I'm just throwing at you. But also active listening, note taking all the while is not an easy thing, for sure. Especially when I'm trying to type very, very quietly so it doesn't pick up by my mic. Um, but we talked a little bit earlier about like the big different use cases, but I think I want to talk about it a little bit again from a different perspective around, again, this is very developer oriented audience. I don't know. Actually, I'd be very curious if you're in a system that allows for you to send us a message. I'd love to know, what is your role? How many developers do we have versus editors versus our fun product managers, et cetera. But I know for a fact, I'm gonna say for a fact on this, that when building out an interface in a headless CMS, we always have 2 very often conflicting needs. The developer need and the editor need. In fact, I know this so well that literally 2 of our product managers, one is in charge of the developer experience of the platform. One is in charge of the editor experience for the platform. And they're 2 very different roles. But when we look at it, they can end up being very at odds with each other because I, as a developer, need my API to perform in a very specific way. I need to make it so that it's easy for my code to like run through. I need to make it so that my data structures could be mapped to whatever omni-channel experience I'm building. But at the same time, if I do that wrong, my editors suffer a lot. Like even like I am a big fan of a lot of things in our interface, and we've got components, and I'm a huge fan of components. If you go too far in components, if you go nest and nest and nest components and set up 15 different types of components, it's not a good editor experience. And that's the same for any headless CMS, right? I go too deep into the weeds on any of these things for my API, the editor experience is terrible. So from an iterative standpoint, we do our research, we find out what our editors need. We think that we're going to be able to do that properly. We find out what our developers need, and we go too far in one direction or the other. I make it not reusable enough for my editor, for my developers, or I make it too hard to comprehend for my editors. How do I go back to the drawing board and get these two personas to also have the conversation? Let's assume I'm not a developer making it. I'm a product manager or whatever. Like, how do I get these people talking internally to resolve this kind of tension?
I mean, just like sit down, have a cup of coffee, calm down, remember that this isn't the end of the world. and like, this is all a job. We're all on the same team, guys. No, but aside from that, I mean, these two experiences don't have to be in such conflict. Like ultimately, you can decide that you're going to work together, and you can decide what kind of experience on either side can be sacrificed for the betterment of the other. And that depends on just how you're going to be working together. And this is also why I would suggest like having regular catch-ups. What to you, because you also, or like a developer or an editor also doesn't need to find themselves in a situation where they're thinking, oh no, we've gone too far, now we need to walk it back. If you're having just like talking, it's like, I know this is crazy, I know everyone works from home now, like we don't talk anymore, like only through screens. But you can have regular catch-ups about how it's going. Like if there's, you can get to a point where you go like, oh no, this actually isn't working. Like let's design this experience in a different way. And yeah, like, I mean, again, like if we're going back to like kindergarten teacher analogy, like no one gets 100% of what they want all the time. That's why another valuable thing to rely on or to come back to is these overarching goals. Like what are our main overarching goals, our tasks related to those goals, the most important things related to those goals, and let's always remind ourselves of those things even as we're getting into the weeds. And this works for almost anything, really. Like there's going to be, it's very, very easy to get distracted.
Yeah.
And that's why, I'm just going to start repeating myself now. That's why it's helpful to go back and say like, okay, well, this was the intention in doing this to begin with. How is this serving that? If it's not, then maybe we just need to put it away for a little bit.
I'm going to serve you up another hardball here because you said a few things that brought things to mind. But all right, so first, we are in this new, for the most part, distributed remote culture.
Yeah.
A lot of that is still going on, despite some companies trying to make that not happen. But I'm a stereotype editors real fast, and I want everyone to know I adore editors. I adore content people. Like again, my start wasn't in development. My start was actually as a producer on a news website. Like that was what I did. I was the editor. I was the content creator. However, my knowledge of them, again, stereotypically speaking, broad strokes here, is they are the long-suffering persona. They are well, this is the way that it is, so there's not a whole lot I can do. I'm just going to work within this. I mentioned like my former editors at my newspapers, right, had sticky notes that explain various things to them. I don't even, this is probably us having had a great conversation before stream, but
yeah, that might have been before.
Yeah. A lot of editors, right, will just put like, here's how I do X, and they'll put it on a sticky note, attach it to their monitor, and they always have it there ready for them. They are always willing to put up with the mess, which is probably a good thing. It's a nice thing. I think it's a great personality trait. You're willing to get your job done even in the worst of times. However, how do I, as an interviewer, or how do I, as an iterative product creator, find out what's actually causing their issues that cause the sticky notes when they're looking at it and they're thinking, this is the way the system is. I will make it work. I'll make it work. It's okay. It's kind of the opposite of like when I talked about like how do you get the ranting person not to rant? How do you get the person to actually talk about their struggles when they're fine with resigning themselves to fate?
There's a couple different ways you can do this, but what came to mind while you were talking was actually watching them go through their workflow process, even if that includes them taking their sticky, I have a monitor right here, like taking their sticky off the monitor, reading it like this and going like, okay, I need to do this, I need to do this. And just have them go through maybe like a simple task, have them ask them what maybe the most common thing they have to do is, and maybe watch them go through it. And I promise you'll probably be shocked. I used to work at a company that made reservation software for restaurants. One of the things that we did was we went to one of our very busy restaurants in the theater district in London and worked a pre-theater service for 2 hours with our reservation software. And the reservation software that I thought in the safety of our office was great and fine when you're trying to seat 10 people at one time and you can't even see the tables, was a total absolute nightmare. And I walked away from that experience thinking, I cannot believe like this is crazy. And so, yes, that's like, this is another example in which like that's slightly different, but what you're getting at is like have someone walk them through their specific experience. Because I can almost guarantee that anyone, sure, they may have been able to figure out how to make all of these workarounds work, but that doesn't mean that someone else watching them do it is going to go, oh yeah, no, that makes sense. That's like, that's very usable. I could totally replicate that if I needed to. Just leave me alone with the sticky notes that probably aren't even labeled. They're just so good at knowing like which one they need to pull down at any moment. Like, and that's also often enough to get you into the sort of like emotional headspace of the other person and to have like empathy, even if it's a small amount of empathy for a small amount of struggle, which is something that's also necessary for any kind of, let's say, teamwork, research, whatever it is.
Yeah, I remember, again, back in my like UX days a long time ago, it was very important that we got as many of our developers to watch the UX testing, the usability testing on their interfaces, because the things that are intuitive to us, whoever the us is, whether we're a designer or a developer or a product person, whoever it is, it's not always intuitive to other people. And figuring out, I would almost say like since we're talking about like a much smaller subset, right? We're not talking about like these big products that are going typically more than like 50 to 100 people, right? Probably. Like actually having, like getting yourself trained. Like, can you like, because you probably trained the first 5 to 10 people when you've implemented, right? And we're going to run out of time. And one of the questions I had over to the side was about like, how do you onboard people? We're not going to get to that, but let's assume that you've onboarded people into the system that you've created. And then a year and a half passes. And again, we talked earlier about bloat, right? Like there's so much that has been put into the system that you're probably not training people on anymore. And if you then get trained, I feel like you also will get a lot of those pain points and weird workarounds that you might not even be expecting. And like that, I feel like might be insightful as well at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, like when you're talking about like pain points and workarounds, especially, like one of the things that can be really interesting is watching how people have solved a problem by themselves, which is what a workaround is, right?
Yep.
And it can also be interesting to think about like how maybe internally or externally, how do they like keep track of the amount of workarounds? Like, what is the, like for me, for example, as a researcher at HighGraph specifically, like what is the acceptable amount of people like doing a workaround for one specific problem before we go, you know what, we should probably address this. um, and but people do this all the time. It's a very kind of natural instinct, especially since as humans we kind of have a tendency to believe that if something isn't working, it's our fault somehow. Like if
Sure.
something isn't intuitive, we assume that we must be using it wrong or we just don't know how to do it. And so we'll kind of, we're problem solvers, we're thinkers. We will figure out how to get the information that we need or the result that we need as best we can without involving anybody else. And yeah, like those, that can just be a really, it can be a way of finding kind of like usability gold, really.
Well, I think really, and this is partially like company shill coming out, but like having something like, say, our app SDK, our ability to create new interfaces within HighGraph, sometimes that can be used to make really great workarounds. Or we should really look at things and say, hey, my editor is doing XYZ on a regular basis. Can I make that better? Like, and there might be a way, not within the basics, like the very like small elements that we provide, but maybe in the bigger elements that we provide that allow you to make whatever you want. And I think that any headless CMS should allow you to customize the experience as much as you can, because every editing team is very, very different. And Steffany,
Yeah.
you were worried that we weren't going to have an hour of content.
I know. I was
We
like, how are
have
we going
like
to talk for an hour?
we have like another hour's worth of content that we could probably talk about, and still not cover everything that I outlined over on my little doc off to the side. But we are at the end of our time together today.
It's okay. After a couple weeks, when everyone gets tired of talking to developers again, I can come back.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of benefit to that. I think we should make it a regular thing every once in a while.
Sorry,
So
I love
any parting
developers.
shots? Anything that you
I said, sorry, I love developers. I really do.
I again, like I've got this mental dichotomy, right? Like
Shade.
former editor, current developer, content
Yeah.
creator. Also, I've got about 5 personalities. It's okay. So yeah. Any last parting shots you want to say? We've had a lot of good conversation. So
I can't think of anything, but this has been super fun, and I hope people enjoyed listening to me rant about this.
I know I did. So I got to do my call outs here at the end. First, I think a really great call out to say would be, if you liked this conversation, we can have conversations like this in text in our Slack community at slack.highgraph.com. Join the conversation. I think Steffany's in there. If not, I'll make sure Steffany's in there. Yeah.
I am in there.
So let's have some more conversations around this in text. And then the other thing I'll also call out is we didn't talk about any tech today, which was refreshing. I enjoyed it. I like UX. However, if you're doing technical things with HighGraph, we do have docs. Our amazing technical writer, Romina, who's actually on PTO right now. Enjoy your rest, Romina. We have great docs, highgraph.com/docs. And if you are interested in using HighGraph in your headless CMS expanse, whatever that looks like, whether it's a blue sky or a brown field or whatever we call those, whatever you're doing, come try it out. app.highgraph.com/sign up. They're free accounts, developer accounts, lots of good stuff there. It's hard to promo when I haven't shown you any code today, but it's there. It's waiting for you. Come hang out. And again, come hang out with us on Slack. And I'll say again, amazing conversation, Steffany. We're going to have you back. This is too much fun not to do more.
Awesome.
And thank you everyone in chat for coming today. And we'll see you doing amazing stuff with HighGraph in the future. Thanks, y'all.